Have you realised that there seems to be a growing interest in things from the past, a yearning for times that are more simple, less noise that isn't relevant to your own life? Do you feel that the nostalgia of those simple times is just getting a little bit stronger? You're absolutely not alone. All of these are part of the reason why I believe that we're in the middle of another folk revival, but potentially on a larger global scale. The likes that we've never seen before, and maybe nobody has really realised. But why? Things are accelerating at such a pace that I personally genuinely can't even keep up. You could genuinely make a Netflix Black Mirror episode about it, and people would think it's normal. But at its core, it's driven by a need to belong, to feel connected, especially within their homeland, along with a rapidly changing environment around them. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened. What happened that caused the previous ones? Let's look a little bit closer at the actual moving parts of a few of them. Because yes, there wasn't just one, and they happen often enough, not usually confined to one country either. The key element within it are the people and the environment. Anyway, once we know what caused the previous ones, the previous revivals, we can pick some comparisons from it and apply it to how things are like today, and it will give a much clearer picture to you. So what is a folk revival? No. Well, firstly, let's start a little bit smaller, right? Let's look at one element of a folk revival. What is folk music? Let's start with that. Simply put, it's traditional music that has been passed down through generations by word of mouth, naturally growing and changing within a culture over time. It's music of the people for the people. It's rich in storytelling, aims to paint a picture of a particular time, from something even as mundane as working in a field, to having a few drinks, to putting yourself in the shoes of a man locked up and shipped away for stealing corn to feed his kids. Not everyone likes the stereotypical folk music, for various reasons. It's the same as any genre of music, sure. But folk music stands out apart from the rest as it's just so closely tied with our past. Now, what is a folk revival then? It's basically when people choose to pick up this old music, right? Music, for example. But not just the music, the language, the traditions, dance, stories, poetry, the lot. Even if in the case of music, the songs weren't learned directly from their parents or grandparents, as is the usual way that folk music survives. It's like a purposeful, planned, thought-out return to their culture's roots. In our connected world, a lot of things can act as a catalyst. And it's not necessarily only because a band is just suddenly popular by chance. There's far more to it than just that. But I'm going to read something out for you. I thought this was pretty good and it sounds familiar. I'm going to read it out from the iPad here. The psychological and sociological drivers of a folk revival are deeply tied to societal anxieties. Revivals do not emerge in periods of cultural stasis. They are reactive mechanisms triggered by rapid modernization, commercialization, cultural imperialism, or profound economic instability. When the pace of technological or societal change accelerates beyond a comfortable human scale, populations frequently experience a sense of temporal displacement and alienation. Cultural theorists conceptualize this reactionary impulse not merely as a sentimental longing for simpler times, but as an active rebellion against the modern idea of linear time and the relentless isolating march of industrial progress. Yeah, so I don't know about you, but when I read that the first time, I actually felt like that sounds awful familiar. What do you think? I don't know whether it's just me or what, but the more connected that we become, like instant messaging and video call, it's an amazing thing, right? Use this as an example. But it's so convenient to connect with people. Like, why don't I do it all the time then? Like, we're so fortunate to have it when you really think about it. Now, I do love to think about this sometimes when I'm bored having my coffee in the morning, just thinking of random old shite as you do. When I was younger, I could have like a single conversation face-to-face with somebody, or just with a group of friends, right? But we're all taking part in that same single conversation most of the time. But now I can talk with my wife, my mother, my father, my brothers, all my friends, all at the same time about completely different topics. It's absolutely exhausting sometimes. One conversation might be something stressful, right? And the next one might be something hilariously ridiculous, like the consequences of drinking too much pints mixed with a dodgy Chinese takeaway. It's happened to all of us. Now, try and imagine it, right? How would that feel sitting in a room full of people, everyone around you, talking at you like that? It sounds pure nuts, but that's just one example, right? And I don't know, maybe I might be the only one who feels that way. You can let me know about it right down in the comments below. But you have to admit, things are accelerating fairly quick. Now that it's a bit hard to keep up, I feel that it's only natural that us humans, right, we can get overwhelmed sometimes. It's perfectly normal. Maybe that's a side effect of the way that I act around instant messaging. And I don't even know it. That I miss the days where I could agree with my friends in school, for example. I'll meet you at the spot in town at 3 p.m. on Saturday. And then you just have to trust that they're going to show up. Let me know what you think about all of this anyway. Do you feel the same? But let's put that side story to the side now, okay? From that bit that I read to you earlier on, we can say that a folk revival is driven by a quest for authenticity in an increasingly commercialized world where mainstream culture is seen as fake or empty of any culture. People just naturally yearn for like a sense of rootedness, you know, of familiarity. And that's also backed up even more by a lot of the comments from you all on a recent post that I made, which I'm going to read a few of them out at the end of the video. But traditional songs can be stripped of their original contexts and reimagined to address issues that we're experiencing today, like loneliness or having money troubles or issues with politics. I read a bit here that came from the band the Mary Wallopers, who are from the best town in Ireland, by the way. They said something along the lines of that they can perform a 400-year-old traditional song about abusive landlords without changing a single lyric, and it perfectly sums up the anger surrounding Ireland's current housing crisis. This is the perfect example of how a folk revival can happen. But hang on, how do we know for sure, okay? Did we know long ago, like when we were in the middle of one, in one of the previous ones? Or did people only just look back on the years and label it as a folk revival until afterwards? Like a recession, right? This might be a bad example, but where we may be in one, but it's only marked as a recession after 2 quarters of negative economic growth. Did we need like 2 quarters of positive folk album purchases to say that we're in a folk revival, for example? Well, we already identified 2 things. A folk revival is the act of seeking out of things like folk music, right? Just trying to reconnect with our own culture. And as I said, it extends to more than just music. And also that it's spurred on by increasing anxieties in the world around us. So yeah, I think that in general, we can make a good guess that we might be in one. That could explain an awful lot that's going on around the world too. But what about the other ones, okay? Let's actually look at the previous folk revivals a bit more. Now, I know there was one in the early 2000s, right? Revolving around this storytelling acoustic music. And as I said, this is not confined to 1 or 2 countries. But these revivals can happen anywhere. But the ones I want to talk about are the ones I know a little bit about. The 1950s and the end of the 1800s. So in the 1950s, and as we know, these were the years just after the end of World War II, and in the United States, Senator Joe McCarthy drove something called the Red Scare. They were terrified of anything that looked like communism. Folk music, for example, with its history of supporting unions and workers, was a primary target. Some high-profile bands were silenced, put on a blacklist effectively, and the music was pushed underground. I say it all the time, if you ban a song, you're just going to make it more popular. This backfired as well, and it became a symbol of rebellion in places like Greenwich Village. Young people at the time knew that they were doing something important by bringing back these old folk songs. They saw it as an authentic alternative to the fake commercial culture of the time. Even if they didn't have a fancy name for it at the time, they went looking for older songs from stuff like the Great Depression and rural America to feel more grounded and push past the fake social norms. The word folk was used right away as well. A magazine that started in May 1950 called Sing Out, with an exclamation mark at the end there, that's important. They openly shared the people's music to fight against this mainstream commercial culture. There was a resurgence of American folk music in the beginning with the Weavers, featuring Pete Seeger, who were one of these silenced bands. The Kingston Trio, Peter, Paul and Mary, and God, I don't know, there's actually so many. The list goes on here that I couldn't even possibly list them all. But with Ireland as well being so connected, we had the Clancy brothers on the back of that in the United States, coming in around 1961, and in turn, like a domino effect, inspiring the same movement throughout Ireland with the Dubliners, Chieftains, Sweeney's Men, the Wolf Tones, to name a few. And also before the Clancys ever went near a camera, Sean O'Riordan was pioneering his own movement with the groundbreaking soundtrack for Misha Era, released in 1959, and then Cultúr Culin in 1960. We knew we were in the midst of it, but it wasn't really until afterwards that the actual movement was officially defined. But why did it end? That's an interesting one. Why didn't it continue? Ironically, I read a cause to how the previous folk revival came to its end was thanks to the very thing that it was protesting in the beginning, mixed with a few other reasons, which is really interesting to consider because it is something to keep in mind for how to determine whether we are in another folk revival now, because it'll never be the same framework really. So now have a listen to this here. This is about what caused the end of the last folk revival. There's three things. Commercialization, a movement possessing inherent anti-commercial roots, ironically found itself dependent on commercial success. Acts like the Kingston Trio achieved massive pop chart success with polished, sanitized versions of folk songs like Tom Dooley in 1958, shifting the genre from grassroots protest to mass market television entertainment like the ABC network's Hootenanny. The electric transition and fusion, the acoustic purity demanded by rival purists, was shattered when Bob Dylan performed an electrified set backed by the Paul Butterfield Blues Band at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival. Rock music quickly subsumed folk, birthing fusion genres like folk rock, for example the Fairport Convention or Steel Eye Span, and psychedelic folk as well, and you could say Celtic punk rock as well, right? Effectively ending the strict traditionalist revival. So fusions there. Institutional rigidity. In the United Kingdom and Ireland, the radical folk club and grassroots pub session formats eventually became institutionalized. By the 1970s, pub owners began paying core groups of musicians to play weekly, establishing rigid customs, unwritten rules, and predictable repertoires that stifled the movement's early participatory spontaneity. And that bit there would explain why a lot of people have said to me that they were a little bit anxious of joining a trad session, that they weren't sure of the rules or they didn't think they'd be allowed to play along. But I know not all places are like that. And yeah, I have seen a lot of places do pay musicians to come in and just play the whole thing. It's like branding. It's like this music is the brand of your pub. So you want it to be consistent, you want it to be good all the time, because you never know what you'll get with a trad session, right? So keep in mind that if we're going to determine what's going on now, especially with fusion, okay, it's not going to be the same as it was in the 1950s onwards. It'll be a whole other compound, but with the same elements. But like the Clancy Brothers' success that was built off the back of that commercialised platform, the Lovely Aaron sweaters were definitely a product of that, for example. They had an image and an audience to serve. That image could have been part of the very reason why the revival ran its course. But now, let's go back a good bit earlier than this, to the 1800s. The Gaelic Revival, for example, in Ireland, during the late 19th century. This happened as a direct response of British colonial dominance for centuries. The country was barely recovering from the Great Hunger. And then as well, you had the rapid Anglicisation of the island. Now here is a completely different cause in contrast to the 1950s, which we can compare directly to what we might experience today. In Ireland, the culture was dying out. Music, language, traditions, English imperialism had actively attempted to erase the culture. But as a result of this, people didn't sit back and let it happen. The Society for the Preservation of the Irish Language, founded in 1876, the GAA, the Gaelic Athletic Association, in 1884, and the Gaelic League in 1893, all were formed to preserve the various aspects of the Irish culture and to de-Anglicise the Irish people. And it worked. Now, as someone who lives in Japan, and I do frequently scan the news headlines, there is like a movement happening here as well that I can pick up to preserve Japanese culture. There's a lot of controversy behind it as well, which I'm not going to get into. But one of the people responsible for the policies behind it said basically that the culture of a country is the most important thing to preserve, to keep their identity. If a country doesn't have a culture, then what is it? Even down to their accent, right? Imagine if that was gone. Imagine if Ireland and Scotland had no traditions. A wee thought experiment here. Just imagine if they just straight up didn't exist. How could you possibly identify whether someone was Irish or Scottish without having a demand to look at their passport? If you take away the culture of a country, a person could potentially lose a huge part of their own identity. Now, look at today. Globalization. We're coming more online. We're feeling more disconnected from our roots. There's AI in your fridge. There's a subscription service in your printer. You scan through social media and you as a person in your home in the middle of Europe are connected to the politics of the United States. Happenings around the world affect you more than you're aware of it. Similarly to the end of the 19th century and today, we're getting more and more disconnected from our culture through no fault of our own. Our world is more connected than ever, that traditions may be far more niche than they used to be. What do we have to do in order to reconnect with our traditions? We have to put the phones down and seek it out. Read about history, learn the language, read the stories, listen to the songs, listen to the bands who are championing these old songs. They in turn become more popular. We then connect with people who also feel the same way, like we mentioned at the very beginning of the video. A folk revival is when people actively seek these things out as a way to escape the current pace of the modern world, to reconnect with the simpler times, or just to feel more stable and safe in a more and more chaotic globalized world. It sounds awful familiar to me. Here's another thought experiment for you. Imagine it's 2030 and there's AI generated music all over the shop. There's AI videos left, right and center. You go to an art exhibition and it's all AI generated artwork, where you can read the prompt that the artist wrote to achieve the actual output. Sounds complete and utter ridiculous, because it absolutely is. And I like to think that it would never get that way. But just imagine it for a second. Imagine that it was your world. And then you suddenly stumbled across a platform where you could listen to only human-made music. Art, stories, movies. What are you going to do? I think the majority are going to seek out the authentic human-made stuff deliberately. I think this is going to be another factor in the next folk revival, whether it's actually happening right now or in the next few years. But now this next bit is where it gets a bit complicated. We can easily reflect back on history and understand the previous folk revivals. It's all history. It's well documented, but who would be at the forefront of it today? The reason I say it's more complicated is because of this. The 19th century revival I was on a bit earlier on, it's confined to Ireland, right? The 1950s in the United States, which had a knock-on effect in Ireland and the UK. No surprises there, because we are also connected. I am fairly sure that there was also a connection to Australia and New Zealand as well. I'm really sorry for anyone listening from down under. I didn't actually dive too much into it here, but maybe somebody who knows more than I do and I can shed a little bit of light on it. But to the best of my knowledge, I only ever viewed it as a United States, Ireland and UK revival. But yeah, basically a folk revival isn't a thing that has to happen either globally or is confined to a particular country. It happens as a result of what we mentioned already: social, economic anxieties, combined with people deliberately seeking out old traditions to feel more connected to their culture or their identity. So I don't honestly know. How far could this one reach? I, for one, don't think it could be confined to just the United States, Ireland and the UK, or Australia, New Zealand even. Like I said, from my experience in Japan, there seems to be a growing interest in preserving culture and conservatism for various reasons. It very well could be a global cultural phenomenon that I absolutely would not have the knowledge or the resources available to say what is the root cause. But from what I know, it all boils down to human nature and the desire to feel connected to your identity, to feel like you belong with your community and part of your culture. But what do you think about this? Also, it could very well be a case where some generations are kind of exempt from even being aware of this. Like, imagine those who were born between the 1990s and the early 2000s, right? They had their college years completely upended by COVID and were thrown straight into a working world where mass layoffs are common and suddenly AI is a massive thing. Maybe previous generations aren't really feeling the same stress factors, but I absolutely don't know. Again, this is all my own opinion on things at this point, and I'd really love to know your take on it as well. If we were 20, 30 or even 40 years in the future, looking back at the 2020s, who would historians say led this modern folk revival? For Irish music at least, you'd likely see a few distinct pillars. Take the Mary Wallopers, for example. I mentioned them earlier regarding the 400-year-old song about landlords. They essentially lifted a centuries-old track without changing a lyric, and it resonated particularly with the current housing crisis. They act as a direct echo of the 1960s ballad boom, a modern intersection of the Dubliners and the Pogues. Then you have Lankum. They are shifting traditional songs into much darker, experimental territories. They deliver the lyrics and actively force you to feel the heavy weight of the story. In the United States, Dropkick Murphys serve a similar foundational role. They have been active since the late 1990s. When reading comments on past videos, their name appears constantly as the primary gateway for the American diaspora connecting with Irish roots today. And then you have Kneecap. An Irish hip-hop group might raise eyebrows in a discussion about folk. Remember the core definition: folk is music of the people. These lads speak directly to the realities of a massive portion of youth in Belfast and across Ireland. Even Shane MacGowan recognised their place in the tradition. Taking the raw elements of the culture and reshaping it through hip-hop opens the concept of folk to an entirely different demographic. It expands its reach entirely. This is why it feels like the beginning of a completely new phase of the movement. At this point, I don't think anyone could accurately document what is happening on a global scale. There are far too many moving parts. We are entirely speculating based on the patterns of the past. But it does seem that a fair few of you seem to think the same when asked if you felt that we were going through a folk revival of some sorts. Let me read a few of these comments out for you. These are some great ones. Cameron Johnstone said, "I feel like younger people are trying to belong, connect to something deeper within themselves and within their homelands. Folk music goes hand in hand with that. Whether it's Irish folk music, Scottish folk music, so on and so forth. After all, folk music is steeped in ancient history and can have a lot of deep meaning, which people are craving in this sometimes shallow feeling world, especially nowadays." Letatape said, "I'm based in Melbourne, Australia, where there are massive scenes of diverse musics. The folk scene used to be a bit of a fringe thing, but thanks to a lot of dedicated and smart folkies, they've really opened up the folk scene here. There are so many strands to it now. I think some of it comes down to some people being sick of technology everywhere. I just folded up my hard rock group to go acoustic, but that was because I was fed up of having to yell over the amplifiers and losing my voice." And Kathleen McGee said, "I agree it's time, and in my life I have seen when the world is in tough times. The music takes over. I really hope the music takes over." And Haunted Furniture said, "I surely hope so, but I do also think so. It's needed. It's time. It's absolutely time." Now, I could make a fairly good stab at it based on what's happening in Ireland, which I feel like there is a revival of sorts happening. But the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and the rest of the world, it would be impossible to label it unless you had some kind of piece of technology that can somehow read everything that's on the internet and somewhat understand what's happening at that global scale and then give you the answer. Yeah, but what I do know is if there is a folk revival going on, then you need the same stress factors that you had for the Gaelic Revival and the American folk revival at a global scale, which I believe we're getting to. So potentially, this could be the biggest one that we'll be talking about in the history books. But we'll only know that once it runs its course.